Welcome, market participants, to another Three Things in Credit. I'm Van Hesser, Chief Strategist at KBRA. Each week, we bring you three things impacting credit markets that we think you should know about. So it's Masters Week. I assume most of you are aware of golf's first major on the calendar. And as a result, I really don't care for the market volatility we've had that's gotten in the way. But I did find it amusing that the president described tumult in the bond market this week, and I mean serious tumult, as being a bit yippy. That, of course, is a technical term in golf where some poor individual agonizes every time he or she is faced with making what is, by all accounts, a relatively easy short putt. That person suffers from the yips, someone who gets yippy. Notwithstanding the pause, I think the markets are still yippy. This week, our three things are: 1. Policy guardrails. They turned up this week to do what they're supposed to do. 2. Credit shock absorber. The presence of private credit in scale is a welcome development in stressed markets. And 3, Canada and Mexico. Our head of sovereign ratings, Joan Feldbaum-Vidra, provides some much-needed perspective on the fate of these two important trading partners. All right, let's dig a bit deeper. Policy guardrails. At the risk of stating the obvious, credit markets work best when there is stability. When debt issuers and investors get on the same page with regard to the economy, that drives the risk premia and fiscal and monetary policies. Those drive the risk-free rate. With regard to policymakers, the White House, Congress, the Fed, we look to guardrails to curb or soften the most aggressive policy leanings, especially if there's an ideologically driven agenda present. Separation of powers, the media, markets all play a role in creating stability. It took a while, but this week we saw evidence of all-important guardrails check the new administration's surprising and ever-changing tariff policy, something that was far greater in magnitude and scope and far more chaotic in its deployment than what the markets had been expecting. It was becoming clear that businesses hampered by uncertainty were joining consumers, investors, and global allies in experiencing a loss of confidence in the administration's policy design and rollout. Stock markets and treasury markets tanked, something where there was little ambiguity or comfort in the message that paired trade was sending. Meanwhile, cracks began to present in the president's formidable solidarity among the Republican Party, with Senator Ted Cruz warning that tariffs threatened a GOP bloodbath, in his word, in 2026's midterm elections if the administration didn't change course on trade policy. Soon after, 7 Republican senators signed on to a bipartisan — is bipartisan still a thing? In any event, a bipartisan bill requiring congressional approval of tariffs. Then we saw business leaders rise up and call for change, including major GOP donors Ken Griffin of Citadel and Pershing Square's Bill Ackman. JP Morgan Chase's CEO Jamie Dimon then weighed in, saying recession is a likely outcome of the administration's trade policy, while BlackRock's Larry Fink said most CEOs he had talked to believed the U.S. was in recession. Oaktree's Howard Marks said the policy was the biggest change in the environment that he had seen in his 56 years of investing. The chorus was growing. It took a while, but those guardrails, the treasury market, the stock markets, business leaders, Republican Party leaders, worked to buy time and give the administration a chance to refine its trade policy. For now, credit investors are better off as a result. All right, on to our second thing: private credit as shock absorber. The new administration's tariff shock got us thinking. Equity markets were plummeting. Check. Treasury markets selling off hard? Check. Uncertainty spiking? Check. An article in Bloomberg caught my eye. Private credit swoops in as volatility rattles banks' debt deals. Part of this movie we've seen before. Syndicated buyout loan deals hung, caught up in market dislocation. Enter private credit. Now, no one expects private credit to ride to the rescue of every struggling deal, and we certainly wouldn't be looking for a nice tight bid-ask resolution. But we have long believed that private credit in scale is a better shock absorber in dislocating markets than what used to be in place, namely large global banks. Think back to the GFC. Those banks were loaded with risk and, in comparison to today, thinly capitalized. They also were heavily regulated. So when sentiment shifted and liquidity dried up, the banks ceded control of their balance sheets to regulators who were incentivized to write distressing loans and securities down hard. Asset prices fell off a cliff, and a downturn turned into a crisis. Today, much of that risk has been pushed out into private markets, diffused among 1,000 institutional investors around the world. Moreover, according to research, direct lenders have some $433 billion in dry powder to deploy opportunistically. Quite a different story from the banks circa 2008. Now, we're not naive enough to believe that private credit is going to smooth every zig and zag in a stressed market, but we do believe that it represents a better shock absorber than regulated banks. And when push comes to shove, that's always welcome to credit investors. All right, on to our third thing, Canada and Mexico. Joining me today is Joan Feldbaum-Vidra, Senior Managing Director and Head of our Sovereign Ratings Group here at KBRA. Joan, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome to you, and thanks for having me.
You bet. So, Joan, we've had many conversations over the years about global trade and globalization. And now, well, the spotlight is yours. Give us your thoughts on how we've gotten here. I think we can skip the discussion on Heard and McDonald Islands, but talk to me about China, Mexico, and Canada.
Sure, Van. Well, those three countries were always going to be very likely targets of the Trump trade wars because of two primary reasons. First, they're the biggest sources of the U.S. trade deficit. And second, because the issues surrounding the tariffs are more complicated than just fair trade or commerce. On the first point, China, Mexico, and Canada are by far the largest trading partners to the U.S. China's share going to the U.S. has receded, but it's presently number one in position, and even larger if you think about all of the trade diversion that's occurred through Vietnam. Trade is incentivized on the building blocks of comparative advantage, and clearly, labor-intensive production is better placed to be conducted outside of the U.S., where it's much cheaper, and that's why it's migrated to areas such as China and Mexico. Well, as for Canada, energy is a huge part of the trade basket with the U.S. Trump wants that dependence to shrink organically through greater investment in energy production on our soil. But on to that second reason, i.e., it ain't just about trade. This relates mostly to Mexico, but also Canada. Cracking down on illegal immigration and decimating drug trade are also key policy priorities of this administration. For Mexico, immigration is less a Mexican problem and more of a Central American spigot problem, so potentially easier to crack down. Mexico has also proven itself on fentanyl. For some reason, Trump has in his mind that Canada is part of the problem on both of those fronts. I'm not so sure Canada can deliver as easily because I'm not sure it's such a problem, but I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. So, how punitive are the tariffs on Mexico and Canada? No need to comment on China for now. We're all watching that story as it continues to unfold.
To be honest, with all the carve-outs for the tariffs, relatively speaking, Mexico and specifically Latin America and Canada, well, the impacts may be less severe than what at first seemed to be likely. Again, this is relatively speaking, although depending on how the tariffs evolve for the rest of the world, which now have just been standardized and postponed for 90 days, there's some relative strength. Overwhelmingly, the U.S. trade balance deficit stems from the auto sector, of course, cars and car parts, and the tariffs in that area hasn't been delayed or standardized at 10%. But let me quickly review what these carve-outs are. First, for the 25% tariff on the auto sector, which again does not fall under that fortnight tariff announcement that Trump made yesterday, it's only applicable to non-USMCA countries. Trump also gave USMCA countries a 1-month reprieve. Second, USMCA compliant goods are not subject to tariffs where rule of origin puts production in the US. And with about 50% of all autos involving supply chain production, that's a very significant carve out. The USMCA threshold, by the way, is 75% labor and content in North America. So it's a very, very integrated North American process. And then there's the commodity carve out, third, constructive for all of Latin America, including Colombia, Chile, and Mexican oil. The tariffs on energy are set at 10%, lower than that 25% threshold initially announced. That also helps Canada. The bottom line, it looks to me like Trump is honoring in good part the USMCA. It's up for review next year, so perhaps this is a harbinger of an easy negotiation. I guess we shall see.
All right, so give us an idea of what your general takeaway is with regard to Canada and Mexico. Are we out of the woods?
No way. My comments indicate that perhaps Canada and Mexico are relatively better positioned than some, but there's an external shock, no doubt. And negotiations and retaliation remains a big unknown on what that may bring. Plus, it's a very fluid situation with the rule book seemingly being written on a daily basis. A global slowdown will hurt all. A slowing U.S. will especially hurt USMCA countries. And remember, Mexico not only is subject to an external shock, but a domestically driven shock as well, with a policy environment that hasn't allowed Mexico to achieve its full FDI potential. So again, in relative terms, I think there's some strengths, but in absolute terms, I think it's not going to be as pretty as recent years.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And thanks for the update in general. Obviously, this is going to be a fluid story. I'm sure we'll check back with you soon, Joan, when things develop. Thanks again for participating.
Well, thank you, Ben.
So there you have it. 3 things in credit. 1, policy guardrails. Turns out there are meaningful checks on the administration. 2, credit shock absorber. The presence of private credit in scale is a welcome development in stressed markets. And 3, Canada and Mexico. Thanks to Joan Feldbaum-Vidra, who reminds us that it's not all about China. Canada and Mexico matter. As always, thanks for joining. Don't forget to check in on kbra.com for our ratings reports and our latest research. We'll see you next week.